Lieutenant Yuri Pechenkov of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics spacecraft Lenin, declaring an emergency. This is Lieutenant Yuri Pechenkov of the USSR Lunar Space Expedition calling the Slick Podcast or any ground station. It was a trap. Do not return to the moon. I repeat, we won.
You have tuned in for a Slick Podcast. I'm here to seek the truth. Live from Scotland around the UK. The one and only Slick Podcast. Enjoy the show. Can I ask important questions? No matter how bizarre the truth might be. Tune in for Slick Podcast. Keeping it real, keeping it groovy.
Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, or a very good day to you when and wherever you're listening from. And a very warm welcome to the show. I'm your host, Simon Laurie King. Coming up on today's show, the sky is falling, the ice caps are melting and at an alarming rate. And last but not least, our ozone has all but disappeared to the point of zero protection for us and our children's children. I know this to be true because anyone with access to a private jet and worth their salt tells me such. Today our subject is climate change. Could this up and coming episode be called Heresy in the eyes of some? Yes, absolutely. Is this episode designed to provoke seditious behaviour? No, of course not. Will this conversation be controversial in content and statement? Yes, absolutely. Why then? Because we must. The extremely expensive and life-changing narrative of climate change, in this show's opinion, has to be questioned. And also why anyone raising concerns about such things, regardless of their scientific background and good intentions, are immediately shut down. Shut down as quickly as a reliable nuclear or coal-fueled power station. Why the boos and the hisses? Calm the hell down. Do humans pollute this planet? Yes. As a species, could we be kinder to our natural environment? The answer is yes. Is strip mining, fracking, deforestation, ocean pollution, and the list goes on, fill in the blank, not important, and destroying that which is irreplaceable and thrice? Yes, absolutely. But, and here's the thing, why are there so many double standards and hypocritical practices? The temperatures are going up. No, wait, they're going down. Up and down, up and down. Trust the science, we are told. But when scientists themselves question the narrative with proven facts, they are finished. Their careers and hope for meaningful future advancement gone. When advocates of this nonsense fly around the planet in huge, hungry for high-octane fuel aeroplanes, and our media lifts the carpet and sweeps that fact under the inconvenient truth rug, nothing is mentioned. My guest today is author David Craig, and we will be discussing his book, There Is No Climate Crisis. I enjoyed this book as it confirmed a lot of what I already suspected, and it made me aware of things that I wasn't. Let me again reiterate, I in no way think we as a species have a handle on looking after this planet. No, not even close. As I've said before, as a species, we should be so much more than we are today. However, I don't believe the sky is falling, and I also know that behind the curtain, the puppeteers continue their play. So all that said, and without further delay, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome David Craig to the show.
Hi, hello.
Let's get the ball rolling on this one. I am certainly someone who believes in climate change. However, not in the way that phrase is used by so many today. The climate is and has continued to change. Amongst the many things to highlight would be common sense. The integrity, bravery and honesty of the mainstream media. In my lifetime, I can't say the media were ever only about the pursuit of truth, regardless of political or corporate pressure, but it seems that could be a factor today. If the media printed or spoken word tells society the sky is falling, then generally, because it's presented by trusted frontmen and women, the masses are willing not only to believe this, without question. But as is a consequence, and so often true today, society then pays more and gets less. However, like a lot of people now who question this narrative of our planet facing an imminent end due to our selfish ways, and after having read your book, there is no climate crisis, I can tell you with confidence and absolute certainty that, in fact, the Emperor has no clothes. David, could you begin by telling us about the acronym CAGW, which is probably where we should begin, as it's the first and foremost war cry and explanation by the ill-informed climate change fanatics these days?
Well, first of all, CAGW stands for Catastrophic Anthropogenic Climate Warming, or global warming. Catastrophic, obviously. Anthropogenic means caused by people, human activity, and then global warming. But we have to be careful because they don't call it that anymore, because the Earth hasn't warmed since about 2002. So now they've changed the name to climate change. So whether it's hot or cold or rainy or dry or it snows or doesn't snow, it can all be called climate change. So the game that the climate catastrophists are playing is the game of heads I win, tails you lose. Whatever the weather, they can say it's climate change.
I do know that humans as a species litter and make a mess of their environment. That I, for one, don't believe that they are altering the climate, as in the way we're being led to believe. The narrative of our biosphere, climate being affected by us, has been an ongoing, ill-informed witch trial. You point out in your book that in the 1920s and 1930s, science and the media declared a global heating and foreboding total glacier meltdown, absolutely and most assuredly, citing it was the most hottest summer back then in 4,000 years. But around 1950, the new scare was temperatures were now falling and a new ice age was heading our way. 23 years later, in a letter to the then President Richard Nixon, the hysteria spoke of a new ice age to envelop our planet within a century. I, for one, am certainly confused by this waxing and waning of the extremes, as global warming seems to be the vogue at the moment and not a new winter wonderland as predicted beforehand. Could you maybe comment on that waxing and waning?
Yeah, we've had three major climate scares in the last 100 years. As you say, in the 1920s and 30s, the scorching hot 1920s and 30s, the temperatures did increase. Those were the years of John Steinbeck's novel Grapes of Wrath. The experts predicted the polar ice caps would melt, the sea levels would rise by several feet, coastal cities would be flooded, lots of farmland would be lost, there'd be millions of deaths, and it didn't happen. In the end of 1950s, the 1960s, 1970s, the Earth cooled so much that the experts predicted there would be a new ice age. They imagined that there would be crop failures throughout the whole of the northern hemisphere. Millions would die of starvation. There would be a mass movement of people from the north towards the south. There would be wars between different countries as people fought to get hold of food. The situation was so serious that the FBI even was commissioned to do a special report on the likely effects of the coming ice age. And about 200 of the world's leading climatologists met at the university in New York and drafted a letter to the president, then President Nixon, warning of the complete disaster that was coming with the new ice age. That didn't happen either. 1980s, the new story is that the Earth's warming, the ice caps are going to melt, it's global warming, there are going to be fires, atmospheric disruption. So we really have to put the latest climate scare in the context of the last two that didn't happen, and is this one real anyway? The unfortunate thing is the use of we never really had any proper measurements of warming or climate of temperatures until satellites were launched in the 1970s and not really used till the end of the 1970s to 1980. And 1980 was at the end of the cool period, 60s and 70s. So that was the coldest period in the last century. So what they're doing is they're taking the coldest period, the beginning of the 1980s, and of course there has been some warming since then. But it is misleading to choose the coldest possible day in winter or whatever, and then say, oh look, everything's warmer since then. And the warming hasn't actually. First of all, satellites do not actually measure temperature. They use some complicated algorithm to calculate the temperature from the ionization of the air or something. I don't really understand it. But it hasn't actually warmed since 2002. There was something called a pause from 2002 to 2014. And since 2014, we really haven't had that much warming. So what we've seen in the last 40, 50 years is a warming since the absolute cold at the end of the 1970s that doesn't prove that we're actually getting into climate disaster and the earth burning up.
You mentioned that scientists in the past in the USA that would dare to question the narrative would have had their careers destroyed, almost accused of being a heretic or blasphemous. All jokes aside, the CO2 deniers, which was another name used for them, could and were threatened with prosecution under the RICO Act, Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations. Were, to your knowledge, any scientists or researchers ever prosecuted simply for doing their job whilst giving a presentation of telling the fact-based truth?
First of all, it was only a proposal from a group of climate catastrophists that the RICO Act should be used. But plenty of people have had their careers destroyed. In Britain, one of the most famous was David Bellamy. I don't know if your readers are young enough to remember him. The moment that he suggested that climate change was a natural process and not a product of human activity, he was finished. He lost all his contracts. He never presented any more programs. He was non-personed, cancelled, deplatformed. In the US, several top climatologists have lost their jobs. And if you look at, about 2 or 3 years ago, there was a document produced called the World's Climate Declaration, signed by 1,500 scientists, geologists, economists, and so on. And the interesting thing there is a lot of them are retired. People are afraid to speak out against the climate change cult because they will get deplatformed, get cancelled, and they'll lose their jobs. In April 2021, the magazine, The Scientific American, which is meant to question, all aspects of science, agreed that from now on, they would not run a single story about climate unless it used the words climate emergency. Moreover, they would not agree to work with any other media or any other journalist unless those journalists also used the words climate emergency. So what we have is a kind of a hidden censorship. I mean, even in my case, when I told my literary, I've had about 7 or 8 books published by mainstream publishers. When I told my literary agent I wanted to write a book about climate, he said, "You're wasting your time." He said, "I refuse to sell this." He says, "No British publisher will accept it because they'll be afraid of the Twitter mob. No British bookshop will sell it because of fear of the Twitter mob." And so what I had to do was invest my own money to self-publish the book through Amazon, because complete refusal by my agent and I guess the publications, publishers, to take the book. We've even seen when J.K. Rowling was a rather better writer than me, and rather better selling writer than me. At her publisher, several authors withdrew the books from that publisher for publishing J.K. Rowling's book, because J.K. Rowling had insisted that a woman is a woman and a man is a man. So there's a massive degree of censorship and a suppression of anybody who dares suggest that the climate change religious cult may actually be wrong.
This is where we find ourselves. I well remember, and I should think a lot of my listenership well remember, the very renowned and credited Dr. David Bellamy, decades of his television programs, his books, a very, very, unfortunately he's no longer with us now. But yes, I heard this as well. I should have brought that up, that he was completely hung out to dry. And as far as you having to self-publish your books, for fear of, well, no fear, because you don't seem a man that would be feared of this. You're saying the truth, but it seems like a very cowardly act on behalf of your publisher. Forgive me if that offends you, that they wouldn't. It's a work of literature. You're not being racist. You're not being fascist. You're not slating a particular doctrine as far as religion goes. But there again, are you? I don't know. Anyway, am I right in saying that according to the man in the television, polar bears are on thin ice? They are dying out because the Arctic sea ice is definitely melting, and this could be proven by rising sea levels. This is tongue-in-cheek. Just ask anyone aboard the Russian research vessel. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this right. The academic Shakalsky. No, I say this as thank you. As I said, I'm saying this tongue-in-cheek because of hysterical predictions of the Antarctic sea ice being completely gone by the past summers of 2012, 2013 and 2014 by the Guardian newspaper, to name one, and backed up by the super climatard Al Gore. What do you have to say about that, being on thin ice as far as the polar bears go?
Well, first of all, don't worry about the polar bears. In 1960, there were around 12,500. By 2010, there were over 28,000. They're thriving. Their problem may be that there are too many in a small area. And that is causing problems with getting food. There was a treaty, an international treaty in 1973, whereby only 900 polar bears a year were allowed to be killed by local people using traditional methods. And since then, the numbers have exploded. So you can relax about the polar bears. They're doing fine. That was predicted to be gone by 2008, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016. Sorry, I'm getting boring. 2017. Oh, it's now been pushed back to 2035. I remember when I was young that there was an American submarine that surfaced at the North Pole in the sort of 1950s because there was so little ice. In 2008, there was an intrepid explorer who was going to kayak 1,200 kilometers to the North Pole to prove that the Arctic sea ice was melting. He did 135 kilometers of the 1,200 before he had to turn back because there was too much ice. Then we go to the Antarctic. In 2015, NASA's satellite showed that the gains in sea ice, in ice in the Antarctic were much greater than the losses. And in 2013, we had this famous story of the Russian research ship, the academic Shakalsky, which went to on a expedition to prove that the Arctic ice was melting. It got stuck in ice. The ship that was sent to rescue the people from the academic Shakalsky got stuck in ice. And a third ship, which was sent to rescue the people from the academic Shakalsky, they had to stay clear of the ice and send over helicopters to rescue the people. We really shouldn't worry too much about the Arctic sea ice either. There is a small part of the Antarctic, I believe, a kind of long peninsula which sticks out. And as I say, there has been warming since the 1980s. And I believe a small part of that peninsula has possibly broken off because of the warming seas. But that's got nothing to do with man-made global warming. And as I said, the NASA have said that the ice in the Antarctic is actually increasing. Oh, the other thing is there's a reasonably recently new polar research station in the Antarctic, and they've had to build it on extendable stilts so that as the snow and ice builds up, they can keep raising this thing above the level of the ice and snow.
So the research station being built on stilts, I'm guessing it has to be raised because of the increasing ice level.
Absolutely.
So the hysteria that
they'd have built it on a boat if the ice was melting.
Correct. So the hysteria that bans people from or stops people like yourself really publishing books, or would discredit people like Dr. David Bellamy and have people maybe like myself being called a denier. I'm only a denier of the current narrative. That science is actually at fault when you say that. So there's two research ships that were locked in ice, were trying to absolutely prove that the ice was melting, and a kayaker that was set out on his canoe that couldn't because of the melting sea ice. And I believe the reason he said that he failed is because of the melting sea ice. Is that correct? Did I misread that on your book? He said that carry on, sorry.
Yes, he did say that there was too much ice floating around. Sorry. He did say there was too much ice floating around, and that's what stopped him. But he blamed global warming for that. But, you know, if the global warming had happened, he should have been able to get to the North Pole.
Exactly. Could we now focus upon the danger of sea level rises? To my understanding, the next few years, we will lose places like the Maldives. I've been there, and they are beautiful. Due to this impending doom, in your book, places like Stockholm, the sea level is falling. And also, could you explain a rough explanation of post-glacial rebound and glacial isostatic rebound, if you wouldn't mind?
Probably not, but I'll have a go. In the last 20,000 years, since the most recent ice age, sea levels have gone up by about 120 meters, which is about 60 centimeters per century, I think. Sea levels are now rising at 1 to 2 centimeters per century. That is not a lot. In my local beach, they've started rebuilding things to compensate for climate change, but really 1 to 2 centimeters every 100 years isn't actually a huge problem. Even the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, admits that there has been no acceleration in sea level rises for the last 100 years. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, admits that there has been no acceleration in sea level rises for the last 100 years.
We will be right back after this message.
Hi, this is Elon. Cards on the table. I am not sure if we're ever going to get to Mars. I also don't hold out a lot of hope for electric vehicles that don't require coal or nuclear power to charge them up. But what I do know for sure is that listening to the Slick podcast helps me with my creativity, stress levels, and cholesterol. Slick Podcast, keeping it real, and always keeping it groovy.
The Slick Podcast. The Slick Podcast. Yeah, it's a Slick Podcast, truly unforgettable topic. This is Slick Podcast.
A few years ago, there was a documentary made called Earth Underwater. And they showed what would happen if sea levels went up by 2 meters or 4 meters or 6 meters. But the problem is sea levels are not rising by 2 meters and 4 meters and 6 meters. They're rising by 1 centimeter or 2 centimeters every century. So they try to spread this fear of these terrible effects of rising sea levels, but it's not really happening. What is happening is a lot of the major cities are sinking. They're sinking because they're built on soft clay, partly also because of water extraction. Jakarta, Bangkok, and New York, they're all sinking by several millimeters a year. And by claiming sea levels are rising, it's a bit like the passengers on the Titanic saying, "Oh, look, sea levels are rising. What a disaster." No, you're sinking. So it's crazy. As regards Scandinavia, there since the melting of the glaciers from the last ice age and the tectonic movement of the movement of tectonic plates, it is actually being pushed upwards, so by several millimeters a year. So it actually looks like sea levels are falling there. In America, what we believe is happening is that from the ice melting from the glaciers, which are now gone since the last 20,000 years, is that the center of the North American continent is rising, and a kind of seesaw effect is pushing down the coast. So you get this idea of sea levels rising, but they're not. And as for the Maldives, well, they should have been underwater by 2018. But in 2018, they finished off a third, much longer runway at the main airport. And last year, they should have finished the new £800 million passenger terminal at the main airport in the Maldives to increase capacity from 1 million to 7.3 million passengers a year. So really, the people who are putting money into those projects are absolutely convinced that the Maldives are not thinking and will still be there for many more years.
Phrases like the seas are boiling and sea levels are rising as a fact is really laughable. From the coast of this country, from Brighton to the north of Scotland, I like to visit the beaches, and not one place have I ever looked at. Say for Brighton, for example, that's where Brighton used to be. Now, so that would in fact, does that mean the sea levels are rising everywhere else apart from around the coast of Britain, which is nonsense because water does not bulge?
Yes, if you've ever taken a bath, which perhaps some of the climate protesters haven't done, you would know that when you turn the tap on, the water doesn't pile up at one end of the bath. It spreads out evenly. And yet I've seen charts published showing sea level rises at different amounts at different places, which is, of course, complete madness. It's not possible. It's just stupid.
Well, it's the same as the statement of the seas are boiling. I think that's a gross exaggeration, but unfortunately, at the level of gullibility, through no fault of people's own, maybe lack of education, I think a lot of the time it's lack of experience. So those who are coming from the education system now into life, having to find jobs and find their way in life, are easily influenced about the polar bears having nowhere to go, the sea levels boiling, rising. Anyway, let's just move on. So you point out in your book that in the West, we pay a massive amount of money for our energy. Germany being one of the hardest hit because of the many made up tariffs. It's the best way to put it. You also point out that Germany's nuclear power plants were shut down. It what seemed like a knee-jerk reaction. I had to read it twice, by the way, to Fukushima. And now, consequently, there are no backups, only billions of euros to spend on unreliable renewable energy. What do you say about that?
The fastest way for a country to commit economic suicide is to have high energy prices, because then your key industries like steel, aluminium, chemicals, car making, whatever, which use a lot of energy, move to countries which have cheaper energy. Our government in Britain says they've been hugely successful in reducing our CO2 emissions. No, they haven't. They've been hugely successful in destroying British jobs because many of our heavy industries have all moved to China. If you go onto Amazon nowadays, it's difficult to find something that isn't made in China. In the US, energy prices are twice as expensive as India or China. Britain is 3 times as expensive, and Germany 4 times as expensive. When you've got those differences, you can't compete. There was complete madness after the Fukushima disaster in Japan. Germany started shutting down, and it should be finished this year, I guess, shutting down all its nuclear reactors. This is crazy because, as far as I know, the word tsunami is a Japanese word. It's not a German word. In fact, the Germans don't have a word for tsunami because they've never had one. So Germany has very little coastline. It's never had earthquakes like Japan. It's not on the ring of fire. there was no reason to shut down Germany's nuclear reactors. In fact, now, just recently in Germany, they've had to knock down some wind turbines to enlarge a coal mine so they can get some coal out to try and get some energy. So it's complete madness. Germany doesn't suffer quite as much. The household energy prices are 4 times China and India, but there are a lot of rebates for heavy industry, so that can still survive. It's more the households that are suffering in Germany. I think in Britain we have a department for net zero and energy security, which is complete madness, because if you want energy security, you need to use gas, nuclear, oil, coal. If you want net zero, you need to use wind and solar. And in Britain, although the climate catastrophists don't realize this, the sun doesn't shine all the time, doesn't even shine at night, and the wind doesn't blow all the time, or else it doesn't blow strongly enough to power the turbines, or else it blows so strongly they have to switch off the turbines, otherwise they'll be torn apart. So you cannot have energy security and net zero. It's a bit like in Dr. Dolittle. I think there's an animal called the push me pull you. It's like a llama with 2 heads, and it thinks it can walk in 2 different directions at the same time, which of course it can't. That's what we're doing in Britain. It is complete lunacy.
You mentioned another phrase, which is net zero. Now, amongst the sea levels rising and the thin ice, no ice for the polar bears, and also I'll point out the misuse of a word. Now, when people talk about organic food, I always point out that when I was at school, organic meant of carbon. It didn't mean overpriced, out of the reach of really who needs it, decent food, which we should all have. Anyway, talking about net zero, and most people say we need to get to net zero. Do they know actually what it means? I didn't until I read your book. Till we move on to the next question, could you just explain how stupid, how unobtainable, and how really loading the gun and pointing to our own heads economically and pulling that trigger, what net zero actually means?
There are different definitions of net zero. The thing is rubbish, because if we import gas from Qatar or Australia, then that is considered not to have any carbon emissions, because the carbon emissions go on to Qatar and Australia. But if we produce our own gas from fracking or whatever, then that goes towards our carbon emissions. So it prevents us getting to net zero. So in fact, net zero is actually having the opposite effect. If we use our own coal for our power stations, that would go against our carbon emissions. So what we do instead is cut down millions of trees in America, chop them all up into little wood chips, ship them all the way across the Atlantic, and use those instead of our own coal, because the carbon emissions count towards America, not towards the UK. So this idea of getting to net zero is causing actions which are madness.
As far as net zero, it means completely obsessively not producing any carbon, which could be economic suicide. Before we move on, could we just clarify, is that correct?
Yeah, it will become obvious over the next few years that this whole idea of net zero is an economic disaster. The idea that you can have hundreds of thousands of supposed green jobs, it's nonsense. If you go into 100,000 homes and rip out excellent gas-fired central heating and put in completely useless heat pumps, that's about the same as taking 10,000 people, telling them to dig a hole and then to fill it in again. It is not creating any economic value. It's creating jobs, but it's not adding. It's costing our country, and that's what they're doing. They're going to destroy lots of good technology, petrol cars, gas-fired or oil-fired central heating. They're going to destroy that, use, and that will supposedly create jobs, but it's not. It's just digging a hole and filling it in again.
And it's doing away with the no nonsense central heating and gas. I suppose if pollution, and there is a lot of pollution on this planet, I get that. As far as big smokestacks from coal-fired power stations or diesel Land Rovers, that sort of thing, that can be fixed. Catalytic converters or anything, that can be fixed. But I don't think we should get rid of that technology. Anywho, moving on. In 2008, shortly after winning the presidency, Barack Obama stated on the subject of climate change, the science and facts are plain and cannot be denied. Sea levels are rising, coastlines are shrinking. And to this, cue audience clapping and whooping as Americans did back then for this young, outwardly mobile, one of the people, free-thinking president. Yet in his retirement years, the Obamas purchased a property costing $11.75 million, a mansion situated on the island of Martha's Vineyard. Is this a sign that ocean levels have stopped rising, or maybe just in that particular area? Or is this another plain in your face, the emperor has no clothes?
Well, first of all, Obama has frequently claimed that 97% of scientists agree that man-made global warming is happening. And I explain in chapter 9 of my book why this is complete nonsense. By the way, Obama's new mansion also has its own private grounds and private beach. So obviously, Mr. Obama personally is not that worried about rising sea levels. But it's nonsense. It's the same as Prince Harry taking a private jet to a conference where he gave a speech about climate change with bare feet to show how close to the earth he was, with John Kerry flying around the world in his private jet to lecture us all about the disaster of us emitting CO2. Al Gore, another private jet fanatic. We had Emma Thompson. I think she took a first-class flight from America to talk at some demonstration against for climate change. So it's just lies and hypocrisy. They know there's no problem, but they abuse their position and to terrify us. I mean, we had Justin Rolat last week, the BBC's supposed environment correspondent, flying down to Alicante to tell us how hot it was. Well, they must have journalists there. They could have interviewed one there. They don't need Justin Rolat to get on a plane to fly down to Alicante, I think it was 900 miles and 900 miles back again, to tell us that it is quite hot, when in fact it wasn't that hot. And there's several people who live in Alicante have contacted me saying it's not very hot here at all. So it's just lies. It's a bandwagon onto which a lot of people have jumped and have a very good, very lucrative careers riding this bandwagon. But it is what they're preaching is not happening.
I've seen some spectacular film of glaciers falling to pieces and crashing into the sea. A massive piece of luck having somewhere there to witness and film it. I'm sure that David Shukman, former BBC environmental and science correspondent, would probably concur with that.
There's a little piece in my book where I play a kind of game. I give a link to a piece of film from David Attenborough's Frozen Planet of the glaciers collapsing. But I also quote from a book written by David Shukman, who was then the BBC's environment correspondent, describing how the film crews filming collapsing glaciers managed to get what they call killer shots. What they do, and it's all explained in David Shukman's book, page 19, I think, is they fly a helicopter over the glacier. They drop explosives down into cracks in the glacier. They retreat. They set up the cameras, get the light ready, make sure everything's fine. Then they set off the explosives, and of course the glacier collapses. In the piece of film I reference from the Frozen Planet, David Attenborough is telling us that fissures within the glacier have caused it to collapse because of global warming. I have used explosives when I was much younger, but that was mainly on rocks. I've never used one with a glacier, but from what I can see a line of explosives going off, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, one after the other in a line, and then the glaciers collapse. So I'm pretty convinced. I've complained to the BBC about this, but they refuse to reply to me, that what we're seeing in the David Attenborough film is actually caused by explosives rather than the film crew happening to be there just at the right time for the glacier collapse.
It seems to be, again, lucrative. There's lots of films on the internet with people being just in the right place at just at the right time to see these massive ice flows crashing into the sea and there's massive waves. So I would concur with Mr. Schuckman there. With reliable nuclear and coal-fired power stations being stood down and decommissioned, the reliance of our own power needs are going to be left to renewables. Without me casting too much judgment, let me ask you, how cold and in the dark do you think we're going to be?
Hopefully listeners are aware that this summer has not been a particularly good, or this July has been a complete disaster. Hardly any sun. The British weather is unreliable. You cannot power a modern economy with windmills and solar panels. Windmills were a leading technology, 800 years ago, and things have moved on since then. I should just be pushing my own book, but one of the funniest books about climate change is a satirical novel by the journalist Ross Clarke. It's called The Denial, and it depicts a world where everybody has a carbon budget which restricts how much they can buy, how much they can heat their home, how much they can travel, and as soon as they reach their carbon limit for that month, whether they're buying meat or imported vegetables or whatever, they're blocked from buying any more. Now, I don't think we're going to go that far in Britain, but we are looking at a future where we've already destroyed all our main heavy industry. We're about to cause chaos in the car industry because an electric vehicle is about 30 or 40% less work than an internal combustion engine. So tens of thousands of car workers are going to lose their jobs. We really are. It is incredible. We are really committing economic suicide. And as for being cold and dark, we are definitely going to be cold and dark. I mean, already 10 times as many people die from the cold as from the heat in Britain. So that figure is going to increase because people won't be able to afford to heat their homes. Well, old people, people who, especially older people or people with comorbidities.
Last question. It seems to me that we are free falling into self-destruction of our own making, or rather, of their making, born out of ignorance, greed, and nonsense, as in nonsense. In your opinion, David, will common sense return before it's too late? Can we, the people, put the brakes on this out of control roller coaster to oblivion? And I choose my words carefully, and I don't believe I've exaggerated. Will future generations step back and realise we already had a good handle on things as far as energy creation goes?
Our problem is all the three main political parties have bowed down, are worshippers of the climate crisis religion. They painted themselves into a corner. They can't admit, oh dear, we got it wrong. We need to change tack. But politicians and bureaucrats can never do that. The big concern I would have is that if Labour, as seems likely, wins the next election, the 2024 election, what they will do is lower the voting age to 17 or even 16, because I believe it's 16 in Scotland, or it was for the referendum, I'm not quite sure. And so we're going to get several million new voters who are completely indoctrinated in the schools by the idea that we evil humans are destroying the planet. And if that happens, I can't see any positive end of this. The Asian countries, they're just laughing at us. It's business as usual. John Kerry just went over to China last week, I think, to get them on board with the reducing CO2. Xi Jinping refused to meet him. They just told him to get lost. They said for them, it's business as usual. They just told him to get lost. They said for them, it's business as usual. So the rest of the world, we're really only talking about the West, which is about 1 billion people out of, 7.5 billion, who are committing economic suicide for no reason at all. And the rest of the world is looking at us, as I said, the Asian countries is business as usual. For African countries, is how much they can get out of us in terms of reparations for the climate destruction that we have supposedly caused. So I don't know. I would get in a few beers and popcorn and just enjoy watching the disaster movie.
That's us to the top of the hour, David. I've really enjoyed our conversation today, concerning though it has been. And I also appreciate the time you have given us today, because I know you're very busy. Before you go, though, could you tell my listeners where they can find your books and more information on the other subjects that you have covered?
Sorry, my book is available as a paperback or as an ebook on Amazon. It is not in any bookshops for reasons which I've explained. If people want more information about this, there's a wonderful website that it publishes new articles every day called The Daily Skeptic, run by Toby Young from the Free Speech Union. And that has a lot of information about what's happening with the climate. Otherwise, there's a website called Real Climate Science, written by an American called Tony Heller. Those are the two places I would go for accurate, reliable, non-biased information.
David Craig, thank you.
No, it's a pleasure. Have a good day.
And that was the There Is No Climate Change interview with David Craig. Controversial, yes, definitely. But this conversation had to be undertaken. Mine is not the only show to have approached this seemingly taboo subject matter. In fact, there are a couple of links below, and I'd say you should check them out for a couple of examples of other shows addressing this topic. Again, I'll state that as humans living on this planet, and as the majority in the Western world, we greatly lack any sense of responsibility for the harm we are doing to our planet, and that harm cannot be denied. The pollution of our air, the deforestation of swathes of jungle, rainforest and woodland, the massive amounts of plastic in our oceans, to say nothing of the countless species that are either extinct or in danger of through our irresponsible actions. All of the above is unforgivable and cannot continue if we want a world left in a few decades' time. But at the same time, let us also not confuse that there is a natural waxing and waning of global temperatures, a natural effect upon the climate. Let's not confuse that and blame ourselves, but work with it and not restrict ourselves and our ability to move forward with freedom and good conscience. Double standards are the flies in the ointment for me. In our world, the military-industrial complex is the only business that isn't checked by silly climate-made-up constrictions, but it is in fact thriving. This world dominant entity is thirsty for oil, land and ultimate power, no matter the cost. Its minions and advocates do very well for themselves. Nothing stands in its way. World peace and our time for the common good sense seems unattainable right now. In fact, it's more likely that aliens will reveal themselves to us firstly than for me waking up to a planet free from war and hate. Just think about that for a second. Why are more people not questioning the narrative of climate change and all that means, the restrictions, and the huge implications of the loss of freedom that I can assure you will come with the increasing implementation of said regimes? Let's look at it another way. Is all well with the climate as far as the weather? I don't know is the honest answer. What I do know is I look towards the sky as the sun rises, and if it's a clear blue sky, swarms of aircraft appear, as if on cue, and their vapour trails of whatever they are turn the blue sky into a grey hue. Just saying. We are, as a people, greatly divided about our environment and its future, confusing our unnecessary pollution with global climate cataclysm. We sign away our rights to efficient energy creation in place of high-priced, unreliable and greatly flawed half measures. What is the agenda here? What will happen to the Western world once the climate hysteria is in full control of our lives? This show believes that 15-minute cities and silly carbon footprints are just the beginning. If meaningful change is desired by people kind for the common good, then allow scientists and not politicians or representatives of the military-industrial complex to seek it out. If a more meaningful way of living is sought out by humanity that resonates with our beautiful earth, then allow true science of free hand to seek it. And last, but by no means least, we as a people should not be afraid to point out their hypocrisy and those who preach one thing but with huge guile and arrogance do the opposite of what they expect from us. I personally care not for these spiteful, ungrateful creatures mocking us whilst looking down from upon high. May they fall from grace. May karma teach them a lesson in humility. I'd like to thank David for his time today in giving this interview, and again my thanks to you, my dear listeners, for attending this cast. Be sure to check out the links below where you can get David's book and the videos I mentioned also. If you enjoyed the show, give it a like, subscribe if you'd be so kind, leave a comment below or send the show an email, theslkpodcast@gmail.com. But either way, please keep them kind. You can find the Simon Laurie King podcast on all the usual platforms, including YouTube and Facebook. And so, my friends, it's time for me to go. Until next time, stay safe, be happy, and certainly not afraid. Bye.
Slick Podcast. Keeping it real and always keeping it groovy.